Okay, web design students, let's talk about mobile first and responsive web design. So let's talk mobile first. This is web design starting with a mobile phone screen and then scaling up to tablets and desktop screens. Luke Wroblewski wrote the book. It's called Mobile First. And the theory is that more than more, people are using their phones to access the internet, so why not start with that experience? Increasing time is being spent on mobile devices, while desktop and laptop time has been relatively steady. Now this graph here is from 2018, but the trend is the same, and if you look at the most recent report, then nothing much has changed here. There's more mobile usage here in green, and it's basically flattened out how much desktop, laptop, or other connected devices are happening here. So for responsive web design, there are 3 ingredients. The first is the meta tag, which we talked about in the previous video. So this particular meta tag is what we need in the head of our HTML to create responsive web design. Meta, name, viewport, content equals, width equals, device width, comma, initial scale 1. This is what's called setting the viewport. So this meta tag goes into the HTML head as always. And it controls the width and scaling of the viewport, that is to say, the browser screen. Some tips. 1, try not to rely on fixed widths, like pixel widths, though sometimes you may have to, but try not to rely on them exclusively. Content should not rely on a particular viewport width to render well, so you want to think for all types of screens. You don't want to just lock yourself into one screen and force your user to have to stick to that one screen. Because like we just said, more people are using mobile, so they may not be using their desktop, which is nicely landscape view. The next thing we need is HTML structure. And so this is where we talk about our container elements. We want to use flexible grids, so using percentages instead of pixels. So in our previous example, we were using 80% width site. That's what we want. We want percentages. We want things to be flexible. So no matter how big your screen is, your content will take up, say, 80% of your site, of your viewport. So we'll talk about things like target divided by context equals result. So what does this mean? So for this particular example, maybe we have a container div that's a width of 538 pixels, and then anything with a section or a side, it's a margin of 10, and anything section gets a float left and a width of 340, and any asides, these are other types of divs. We haven't talked about asides yet, but they're just another kind of div. Asides get floated right and are a width of 158 pixels. So if we have this, we don't want to use pixel widths, so we want to change these to percentages. So if we just put this into our browser to start, section goes on the left, aside goes on the right, and then here's the width. 10 pixels here, 340 here, 10 here, another 10 because there's margin on both of these green boxes. Besides 58, 158, and then another 10. So total 538. But this only looks good on a certain viewport width. So anything that's at least this size, you'll get this same view. So instead, we can use percent instead of pixels. And we'll get nice results at any viewport width. Let me back up. So we want to convert these to percentages. So margins of 10 pixels divided by 538 pixels, because that's the total, will give us this percentage. So same thing here. The section was 340 pixels wide, divided by 538, then that means it takes up about 63% of the viewport. And then the aside, 158 divided by 538, gives you about 29%. So we'll put this whole number here, and all of these go here as percentages. And then we get nice results no matter how wide our container is. So at 100%, it looks like this. This looks good. And then maybe it's 75. Let's squeeze in a little bit. We still get a nice look here. And then 50% wide, nice look here. Nice results at any viewport width. The third thing we need is something called a media query. A media query is a special rule in CSS to plan for different viewport widths. It starts with something called an @ rule, so @media. And from there, we build different scenarios, including different types of screens and different widths. So what will happen is the browser will check to see if certain conditions are met. Like, for example, an @media rule, so all and minimum width screen 320 pixels and a maximum width of 780. This is what we'll type in to our CSS. What this says is, for all media types, all screens, print, etc., we can have all different kinds of style sheets depending on what device this is displayed on. So just to make it easy, we'll do all screens. If a browser width is at least 320 and no more than 780, then the browser will show whatever code is within these curly brackets. And you might be saying, so what? If the media query is placed after some regular CSS, it will override that CSS because CSS works top to bottom, and so it'll take whatever is at the bottom over anything that might be repeated above it. And this is how we get responsive action among different screens, and this will make more sense when I demonstrate this coming up. You may be asking yourself, how do we know what sizes to use? Where do we get 320 pixels, 780 pixels? Well, one way is to go to the internet and look it up. So a site called mydevice.io is a really good one for common pixel widths for devices. So you can look at that now if you want. And this link is in Canvas too. But we should strive to keep our media queries as simple as possible because so many new devices come out all the time, it's hard to keep up. You don't really want to be writing 1,000 different media queries for different 1,000 devices. But if you must, here are a few good standard pixel widths. So most smartphones go to 768 in width. It's not entirely true, of course, but a lot of them do. So you go 768, larger than 768, larger than 992, and then larger than 1200 pixels wide. One more thing to talk about. Make your IMG max width 100% CSS. We did that in the previous video, if you remember. That way, an image will take up the maximum width of the container that it's in, and therefore you should be aware of how wide your containers are. We did that in the last video. So let's do some. If we go to our code, back to our code. Now the first thing we need to do is add the meta tag. Meta name viewport. And then this one is content equals. Now I always have to go back and refer, so let's go back. Here it is. Width equals device dash width. All right. Width equals device dash width. comma, initial scale equals 1. You may see 1.0. 1 is fine. That's the first thing we need for responsive web design. So if we save that, nothing happens in the browser, nothing really changes. It just tells the browser that now we're going to do things with responsive. So be aware or look out for changes in CSS. The next thing we want to do is go to our CSS. We've already have some percentages here. So tiger cover div is going to be 40%. Remember at the beginning, width of 80% for the body. So right now, everything is in percentages already, which is good. So the next thing we need to do is start writing these media queries. And the media queries go at the very bottom. Media, all, and min with, let's go with the first one we were doing, 320 pixels, and max with 780 pixels. Do these curly brackets. So now we can take any of these previously written CSS selectors and do things with them. So just for example's sake, to show you what happens when you make things responsive, we'll take the about div and change the background color to something else. So how we write that, we'll do dot about, and then another set of curly brackets, and then we'll write background color cyan, that's to say. So what this is saying is that for this condition, any screen or all screens, a minimum width browser of 320 and a maximum width browser of 780, the background color will be cyan. Otherwise, the background color would be 255 with half opacity, that's like that pink. So if we go back to our browser, we refresh this, nothing should happen. 1, 2, 3, refresh. So nothing happened. So the real value of responsive web design is that if I were to move this in the browser, make it smaller, once it gets in between 320 and 780 pixels wide, we should be telling the browser that change the background color of this from this pink color to cyan. So if I shrink, 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 or at a certain point, it'll turn cyan. So if we move this in or out, it'll be cyan colored. So that's a value, that's something you can do with responsive web design. Not that you would necessarily do this, but just to demonstrate that you can, here it is. Now something more useful would be to maybe, at a small screen, I don't want to necessarily make this smaller. Maybe I want it to be bigger. And maybe I want this to stop floating and to be underneath it, so that maybe the picture takes up the whole width, and then this text will go underneath the picture so that it's easier to read on a phone. Because maybe you want the pictures to be nice and big on your phone so you can see them, and then the text can just stack underneath of it. So what does this look like? Bring this back, we'll go back to our code. Then we start writing more media queries in here. So in this media query, maybe I want to stop floating the tiger cover div. So tiger cover float none. So let's see what happens. Go back to our browser. Let's go back to that scenario where the background color of the thing was cyan. Here it is. If we refresh this, this text should now float underneath, or not float anymore, not be side by side, but instead go underneath. 3, 2, 1, refresh. Now it worked. The text goes underneath the picture, so it's not floated anymore. But if we make this bigger, then it should float again. So it did. Not floating, floating. Not floating, floating. That's good. We squeeze this back in. Maybe I want the picture to take up this whole space now. So back to our code. And maybe we'll say to, instead of tiger cover or tiger cover width being 40%, remember this was the div that contained the image. Tiger cover, it contains the image inside of it, so that width is 40%. Maybe I want to change this width to 100 so that it takes up the entire width. 100%. We go back and refresh, 3, 2, 1, refresh. Now it takes up the entire width that we give it. So this might be a better scenario for mobile phones or tablets, depending on the tablet, depending on your content. So we can do this for the other ones. So for the other ones, we want spark cover to be floated none and width 100%. Same thing for, whoops. Same thing for whale cover, float none and width 100%. So we save this, we go back to our browser. Now if we refresh, these pictures, instead of being floated, and the size will be unfloated and the size of the entire width. 3, 2, 1, refresh. Now we've got big pictures here. See, this one is supposed to be all the way. Why did it got moved over? Oh, because it has, still has margin right. So we want to get rid of this margin right when it's in here. Let's call it 0 for now. Refresh. Now, what did I do? This one. We margin 0 on the Spark one. There we go. Same for whale cover, margin 0. We may change this margin later on, but for now, we'll give them all margin 0 to turn off the margin rights that were in this version of it. 3, 2, 1, refresh, still the same. So what I just did was turned off any margins that were attached to Spark Podcast or this whale image here. And that's responsive web design. So there are other scenarios where you want things to appear or disappear depending on the size of the browser width, but we'll get into that coming up throughout the semester. Especially for our menu. For our navigation, there'll be changes we'll need to make coming up, but for now, this is what I'd like you to do for your content.